Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first career session for the Code the Dream Practicum class. My name is Lillian Wong, and I work as a learning engineer here at Code the Dream, where I'm usually working on different student success initiatives. But before this role, I actually worked as a career advisor for over 10 years, and I'm also a certified professional resume writer. So I have been recruited to come over on the career side of things. But during that time, in my work in the career services field, I actually worked specifically with engineering students and coding bootcamp students that were usually new and pivoting into the tech field. And the number one thing I heard from students were that they were often really overwhelmed and just didn't know where to even start. So that's what we're talking about today. Where do you start? The answer to that is with your career mindset. Job hunting is so much more than just sending out applications. It's about understanding yourself and the role you're targeting so that you can position yourself very effectively. So that's what we're going to be focusing on here today. That's important because all of this that we're going to be talking about is all to help you find what is called a good fit. Probably a phrase that you will hear a lot of employers say whenever they are interviewing you, we're looking for a good fit. Well, the reason that's so important is because getting a job that's not a great fit for you is a little bit like putting on a jacket that's a tiny bit too small. At first, it's fine, but then as time goes on, it starts to get more and more uncomfortable. It feels harder to breathe, and then it becomes completely unbearable, and you just want to get out. So that situation is pretty unpleasant, honestly, both for the employee and the employer. So that is part of why we want to do some research beforehand to really try to avoid that particular scenario. And to do that, we're going to start with really looking at three things. So starting here at the top, what you're good at. That is just something that you feel fairly competent about. But also is important is what do you love doing? Something that you're passionate about, something that interests you. And then lastly, what pays well? So well is subjective, but you should make sure you're being paid enough to survive. The good news is you are learning how to code, and you've probably realized already that people do pay relatively well for people that have that particular skill. So you've already sort of figured that part out. But a lot of times when people start their job search, I often hear things like, oh, I'll take whatever job I can get, or I am applying for anything and everything. But then when you actually start job searching, you start to realize, oh, actually, I don't want to move to Montana, or actually, I don't want this job that only pays slightly more than minimum wage. And it's okay to have those types of requirements or preferences, but that's why it's so important for you to do the work first of figuring out what is a good fit for you so that way it's the best use of your time. And honestly, this is about getting to job readiness. It's about preparing for the job search. This also applies to interviews, to resumes, to everything. In general, the whole mindset of your career can be summarized into these three things. So, one, researching yourself. What are your top skills? What are your unique strengths? What are the achievements that you're most proud of? Interviewers are definitely going to ask you about yourself, and you're going to need to know how to describe who you are and help someone get to know your personality and your skill set in just a few minutes. And sometimes that can be really difficult, which is why you want to do some of that research beforehand. Step two is about researching them. So, researching the job, the companies, just knowing what your options are in terms of roles is really going to help you just focus on searching for the jobs you really want. And also doing some research about what companies are looking for is also going to help you recognize which of your skill sets are the most valuable or the most unique. Once you start looking at what companies want in terms of those requirements, you're going to start to notice certain patterns stand out. And that's all going to sort of help you to the third step here, which is where you connect those two together. You are going to make it very, very clear to the employer that you have exactly what they want in your application, in your interview, in basically whatever you're showing them. And we're going to be focusing a little bit more on the resume for this particular video, but we will be talking a lot more about that later on. For this session, we're going to be focusing on the resume basics just to make sure that yours is clear, concise, and compelling. But with all of that being said, let's get started. So, step one, like I said, research yourself. Get really, really specific. What are you passionate about? And I don't want you to just say, oh, coding or problem solving, right? Try to really, really hone in on something specific. Think back to the very first moment that you sort of sparked your love for tech. Something must have made you excited to go into this. What was that, and why did that moment excite you? Or you can also think about your practicum experience. So, what part do you feel like you really enjoyed the most, and why? And if you are having trouble figuring out, like, oh, I don't know what I'm really passionate about, you can always start with think about what you hated. Usually, people can definitely remember what they found extremely miserable. So, that helps as a starting point. You can also think about what you hate and then try to get to the opposite of that. And also, if you don't know what you're good at, ask other people. Ask your family, your friends, people you've worked with. Sometimes they will be able to not only identify what you're good at, but also identify what you're passionate about. Like, hey, you really light up when you talk about this, or I've never seen you so happy since you've done XYZ. And that also applies to the second part here, which is what are you good at? Figuring out your top technical skills, since you are going into tech, but also figuring out your non-technical skills as well, like communication, organization, leadership, things like that. So, like I said, if you feel like you have a pretty good self-awareness about all of this stuff and can identify it, great. But if not, ask your family, ask your friends, ask your practical partners, ask the people that you've worked with. Your mentors are also especially very good people to ask about both technical and non-technical skills. Then lastly, like I said, what would people pay you for? And you sort of already figured that out. But in addition to people paying programmers, there's also some tech adjacent type jobs that you might want to think about. So for example, if you've identified that one of your non-technical skill sets is organization, you are really great at developing a schedule and a timeline and, gathering people into meetings and coordinating all of that. You might want to think about things like project management or Scrum Master is another one, or some more people-y type of career jobs that are still in the tech field, but not necessarily just sitting in front of a computer doing web development all day. So do a little bit of exploring, and I feel like as you get to know yourself better, that's going to guide you towards more of the roles that are going to be a good fit for you. All right, so this next section is an activity. Go ahead and read through this and try to take some time to reflect on the answers to these questions. You can go ahead and pause the video if you want, and I really encourage you to write it down somewhere and just, spend some time to really think back to these memories. Oftentimes, we're so deadline driven on just getting things done, finishing those assignments, finishing those projects. We don't really take the time to actually step back and think about how you felt during all of those things. So this is me encouraging you to take that step right now and take a couple of minutes, think about your answers to these questions and jot them down. Okay, so if you've completed that activity, let's move on to step two, which is researching the jobs, the companies, basically directing all that focus we had outwards instead of inwards now. So based off of what you have looked at, these are all the different things you're going to be initially looking at whenever you're searching for jobs. It's going to be things like job titles, keywords, skills, the job duties, job requirements, all of these different things. Start taking note of the types of these things that are mentioned in job postings. And the way I want you to do this is very simple. Just go on LinkedIn, go on Indeed. These are the two job boards that usually have the most amount of positions on there. But if you have a preference for something else, you can use that as well. But I want you to practice looking for roles using different search terms because you're going to notice that different things will come up. So, for example, just searching developer or just searching front end or getting a little bit more specific, right? Searching React or Node. Play with a lot of the different types of filters. So the way I personally like to job search is starting really, really broad and then narrowing that down. You just look for different patterns in terms of what job titles come up. I am going to go ahead and give you an example and show you how I personally like to utilize the filter system. Okay, so I usually start really, really broadly. So for example, if you know that your stack is React, I might just type in React and you want to work remote, then that's all I put. So if you hit search, you'll see that there are 400 plus jobs, which is already a lot. So if that's too many jobs to look through, that's when you're going to start narrowing it down by one of these filters. You can select just full-time jobs, for example, or you can select just entry level, And keep in mind that sometimes these filters aren't entirely accurate, unfortunately, but they do a good job of narrowing it down. So see, now there's only 10 jobs. So you might be like, okay, I want to look at a couple more than that. Then you would remove one of the filters. That brings it back to 300. Then you might look at education level, for example, is one, or when the date was posted. So if you only want to look at the most recent things in the last week, that's a good way of narrowing that down as well. And then you go ahead and click through and look at what they want. So if you've just sort of gotten into tech and you've worked at Code the Dream for a couple of years, I would probably estimate that you have between 1 to 5 years of experience. So things like senior software engineer usually aren't going to be a good fit for you because they're probably asking for more than that. I would say anything that asks for 5 or less years of experience is probably something that I would qualify as entry level or as a beginner type of job that you should be well suited for based off of your experience. Okay, so let's take a look at what might be a good fit. This one says junior software developer, so this might be something that is interesting to apply for. You can read through and notice if they say things like they require a bachelor's of science in computer or bachelor's of science in computer science. Sometimes that's a hard requirement and sometimes it's not. Honestly, you're not really going to know until you apply. So typically the way I like to do this is I look through all of these requirements, and if you have at least 65% of what they're asking for or more, that's generally enough to go ahead and apply anyway. But for now, since we're just doing the research portion of this particular activity, what I want you to do is not so much think about what you have necessarily, but more of just noticing the types of patterns in which employers are asking for things. So for example, in every junior type of React software development role, you're seeing a lot of people mention this particular acronym, right? SCSS. That's something that you probably want to look up if it's being asked for over and over. Let's see if there's anything else here. So a lot of times you might see React alongside Redux, so that might be another good thing to look into just to see how similar are these two. Is it something that you've used before? Is it something you could pick up very quickly, or would it take a lot of time to learn? Same with Bootstrap. That's another one that you might see fairly often. And if it keeps popping up in a lot of the jobs you're most excited about, that's probably a good sign for you to look into that. But this is typically how I like to look for jobs. And that's just an example of how you can do that in the beginning. And again, you're just looking for patterns. You are just job searching casually. Don't feel any pressure to apply yet. This is just doing the research. And as you're looking at this stuff, I want you to ask yourself these types of questions, right? What are the things that are absolutely required in your future job? For example, you know that you have studied React. That might be something that is very critical for you to have in your future job. Other things that would be preferred, but not necessarily required. For example, some people say, hey, it'd be nice to be remote, but it doesn't have to happen, right? As long as it's something that's sort of drivable. And only you can decide what is going to be doable for you. And then lastly, what are the things that are flexible and you'd most be willing to give up? So obviously we would all want a super easy, high paying job that's exactly in your skill set. But generally you're going to have to give and take for a little bit of this stuff. So figure out, like rank basically these values and what are the most important things and what are the least important things. What are you willing to give up in order to have something that you want a little bit more? So go ahead and do the work now. Try to figure out which of these values are most important to you. And that's going to really help that alignment for whenever you do find a job that is, again, that good fit. It's also going to help you be able to talk about why a job is particularly exciting to you whenever you are in that interview. Okay, so that leads us to activity 2. Same deal as before, read through this activity, take some time, pause the video. I want you to find at least one job posting out there that you are excited about and look at what the skills you have versus the skills you need. The skills that you need, is that something that you would want to get? Find at least one company that you would love to work at. And this is not looking at whether or not they're hiring for a position, but a lot of times working for a company that's mission aligns with yours can be important if you want to work at a place that really focuses on giving back to the community, or you really want to work at a place that has innovative tech. Or if you want to work at a really big company versus a small company, all of those different preferences are things that I want you to take the time to figure out now. And then identify at least one type of organization that would maybe fit your needs and goals. So, for example, that might be something like, I really like tech, obviously, or something like, I really want the mission of the company to have something about diversity in it. Or if it's something that's important to you, maybe you have young kids, you're going to need a flexible schedule. That might be a benefit that you really look for. But essentially, same thing as before. Take that step back and really, really evaluate what is important to you in terms of the jobs, the companies, and all of that. Okay, so once you've completed that, that moves us on to step three, putting it all together. So you're going to connect all of this stuff in a resume. We're going to start with picking a resume style or format, talking a little bit about the applicant tracking system, and then basically filling in your resume. So that is essentially activity three, but I will go ahead and do it together with you so that way you have sort of a guideline of what this is going to look like. Okay, so right here, if you go and find the part that is about resume templates, here it is, picking a resume style. So there are already a couple of templates here that we recommend, sort of what we mentioned before with the ATS systems. So a lot of times whenever you are applying for a job, the company is going to run your resume through what is called an applicant tracking system or ATS, which is basically just an application that will scan your resume for certain keywords, see if you're a good match. A lot of the bigger companies like to do this just because it saves them a lot more time. But in order for your resume to even be read by an ATS, you have to make sure it follows certain formats. So for example, a lot of those really, really pretty resume templates out there use things like tables or have multiple columns. And those things all make it a little bit harder occasionally for certain types of ATS to read it. So that's one of the reasons why I would just recommend going with one of these templates. If you click on them, it'll prompt you to make a copy in Google Docs. And it'll look something like this. So this is what we call a one column resume where everything is just in one column. And what's nice is all of the formatting, all of the spacing, the font size, all of that has already been chosen for you. So really all you have to do is just plug in the information that is specific to you. So for example, you would put in your own name here. You would put in something like backend developer if that's what you're looking for. So a lot of this is pretty self-explanatory. You just plug in the information that's personal to you. I would skip the summary and leave that until the very end, just because that's usually the hardest part of a resume to write. For the skills, remember when we were brainstorming all of those top skills you had? This is where you would plug it in. So it might be things like React and JavaScript and HTML and CSS. Areas of knowledge is usually things like that aren't necessarily languages. So it might be something like API integration or debugging. Um, or, oh, I thought this one, since you may have worked on the team using this agile methodology or Scrum. And then sometimes people like to add soft skills on here, things like what we mentioned before, communication, organization, but I personally like to save this by demonstrating it in the work bullets instead of having it here just to save some extra lines. But then in your selected technical projects, you would definitely have your practicum project here, for example. Don't forget that personal projects also count. So if you were working on something on your own time just for fun, or for work or for a volunteer organization or something, that can also go here as well. Because again, it is a technical project. Then in work experience, I would suggest having wherever you're currently working to be on here, or at least your most recent job, even if it's not tech related, just showing your future employer that you have been employed somewhere is generally a good thing. If it's not tech related, I would just keep that section really short. So that way I probably only have maybe 2 bullets, maybe 3, just so that way most of the focus is over here on my technical experience. Then lastly, education. So this is where you would put your associates or bachelor's or master's or all of that. And you usually go from the most recent to least recent. So like you would start with your PhD and then your master's and your bachelor's and your associates. For example, if you happen to have a lot of degrees, this is how you would state it on there. For those of you that have gotten degrees from different countries, it's usually helpful to put where. So for example, this would be Austin, Texas, but if it was outside of the country, then you could also put, you know, basically letting them know that this is a university that exists in a different place. A lot of times people also have incomplete degrees, and the way you can showcase that is if it's a degree that you know you're going back to school for or are in the process of getting soon, you can always do this as present. Or if it's a degree that you know you're not going to be getting, and it was only partially completed, I would say if it is out of the country, and it's not tech related, you don't really have to go into much detail about that. So you could just put, for example, this one, Associates in General Studies. If it is something that's in tech and you sort of want to showcase how that's relevant, it might be something like this. You would put whatever the name of that particular major or program is to show its relevancy. And sometimes I've seen people also put something like relevant courses. And then you can write the names of specifically the classes that you feel like are most relevant that you want to showcase to the employer. Hey, I do know. Let's see, another way I've seen this done is, so say you completed like a bachelor's, but you only did the first 2 years. Some people will put something like, if you have your transcript, you could put something like 60 credits towards a bachelor's of arts in computer science. It'd probably be a bachelor of science. So you can do something like this as well. But I'm gonna go ahead and show you a website that I like to use. Here we go. Let me see if I can find it. Usually there are examples online of how you might be able to list it. Here it is on your resume. And there's a couple of different ways. You want to pick the one that makes you look like you are in the best light. So usually that means if it's relevant, put it on there. If it's not relevant, you can put it on there, but just make it shorter. Here's the example of adding coursework. And then here's an example of an unfinished degree. Sometimes you can just put the name of the university. I would also suggest putting at least the program that you had started. Let's see. Okay, here's an example of saying completed 75 credits towards a BA in this. And there are some additional resources for this as well, but these are the couple of ways I've seen it where you can basically present yourself in the best light. Okay, so let's go back to here. Like I said, the last activity for this particular presentation is going to be you picking a resume template and filling in as much of it as you can. So just try to add in the dates, the names of your workplaces, a lot of the basic information, and don't worry about, whether or not it's being phrased the right way. We want to just start with the easy stuff. Your goal is to get the draft ready, not achieve perfection. We will polish it and work our ways towards perfection in the next session. But all right, that leads us to the end. Okay. So for questions, you can go ahead and Slack me if you have any particular questions. I know we're going to actually cover a lot of what we've spent this session talking about in the last and second session. So I'm going to save a lot of the questions and conversations that I had with people, just repeat that in the next one. But yeah, if you have anything else, please Slack me. And if not, I will talk with y'all later.